One of the most significant challenges that we have in the African marketplaces is we are soon depleting the only finite forms of resource that we have access to. It's one of those things that we really need to interrogate for ourselves as a business owner, as a founder, as a corporate executive, how we have structured our business models. Is it sustainable? Will our business be here for the next 50 years? The way we are interacting with the levels of resources that we have that we regard as forms of raw material, the way we are going about our business, the way we are going about our industry, will this industry be here 50 years from now? Particularly when you're looking at the real estate sector, the rate at which we are soon exhausting land, we might not have some of these entities here 50 years to come. So to that extent, we are denying ourselves the possibility for longevity. Any business needs to factor longevity as a significant tool or a significant driver for decision making. If we don't have longevity, that we have mapped it out, and we need to be very deliberate with how we map out longevity. It's not just for now. We are in business now, but our eyes are 75 years from now. The way we are going about and the levels of resource that we have access to, will our business be here for 75 years? It's a very significant question that any person in the African marketplace needs to consider. It's one of those things that we need to interrogate for ourselves. Can we be here 75 years from now, 100 years from now? It's that longevity factor that most of our businesses and how we have structured our businesses that we are conspicuously lacking. It's one of the reasons why intellectual property provides us with a very unique area for interest. Particularly when you look at intellectual property, we need to ask ourselves, are we approaching the intellectual property conversations as a resource, or are we approaching the intellectual property conversations from a point of an adversarial tool? For far too long in the African marketplace, we have approached intellectual property conversations as an adversarial tool. There is much more to intellectual property than merely an adversarial tool. An adversarial tool is that thing that you hang on to for the unfortunate circumstance that someone else might infringe on what you've created. More than that, it is of little use to you as an individual. It's very important in whichever industry in the African marketplaces that you appear and you operate in. It's very important for you to start entertaining conversations around if our intellectual property was to become for us a form of raw material, what manner of approach ought we to assume as an organization? What manner of approach ought we to assume as a sector, as an industry, as investors, as business owners, as corporate executives? One of those things that we are ideally lacking is we have never weaved intellectual property into our business models. We have never weaved intellectual property to form part of our competitive advantages. We have never weaved intellectual property to be an enabler for us in our businesses. We have never weaved intellectual property to be our equalizers. Intellectual property is an equalizer, the greatest equalizer in any marketplace. Intellectual property is your competitive advantage that you really need to start paying close attention to, and even having policies and thought patterns and decision makings around your forms and available forms of intellectual property to help you figure out new ways that you can maximize and you can exploit your available intellectual property. It is never a question of, Mr. Ogwang, do I have intellectual property? The question that only persists is one: Have you been empowered to identify how intellectual property makes appearance on you as a person? Have you been empowered to identify how intellectual property makes appearance on the face value of your business and through your business processes and functions? Intellectual property is an area of conversations that we cannot neglect, particularly in this time in our history, in this time that we are faced with some of the most monumental challenges of our generation. And that one puts in us places a demand on us to constantly explore new avenues for competitiveness, to constantly explore new avenues for productivity at an individual level, at organizational level. And it's one of those things that I can tell you for free as at now. You need to start entertaining. What is intellectual property? What does intellectual property mean to you? What does intellectual property mean to your business? What does intellectual property mean in your business planning, even as you're projecting? And one of those things that we need to ask ourselves is the longevity factor. The way we are going about our business, for how long will we be here? How long are we going to sustain it? We cannot talk about longevity and ignore intellectual property. We cannot talk about competitiveness and ignore intellectual property. We cannot talk about shareholder value and ignore intellectual property. We cannot talk about competitiveness and ignore intellectual property. We cannot talk about the next generation. When we are looking at posterity, we cannot talk about that and ignore intellectual property. So what does intellectual property mean to you as a business? What does intellectual property mean to you as a marketplace? What does intellectual property mean to you as an industry? How can intellectual property make you competitive? Intellectual property is ignored because intellectual property is conspicuously lacking at most of our boards. Intellectual property is a policy conversation. We need to come up with avenues of ensuring that we create enabling environments for our forms of intellectual property to thrive, for our people to begin exhibiting and thriving in their intellectual property. And one of those things that is conspicuously lacking in corporate Kenya is we lack enabling environments for intellectual property to thrive. That is a challenge. So when we go back to where we started, the greatest challenge that we have in the marketplace is we are soon depleting our forms of resources. Intellectual property is the only form of resource anywhere that does not deplete, that does not lose economic value. Intellectual property is the only form of resource in any marketplace, in any industry, that does not lose its economic value. It's one of those things that you ought to take a look at. It's one of those things that ought to excite you as a business owner, as a corporate executive. My name is Ogwang, and I will see you in the next one. Until then, take care. God bless. Bye-bye.